Thank you, Madam Vice President. Distinguished delegates. For much of the world, Myanmar is out of sight, out of mind, deep in the shadow of other conflicts of human suffering that members of this body are all too familiar with. Myanmar needs and deserves your attention, and more importantly, your action, not only because of the military's relentless attacks on the people of Myanmar, but because there are opportunities available to your governments right now that would make an enormous difference in how and when this crisis comes to an end. I have just submitted 2 special reports or conference room papers that I hope will strengthen your understanding of the crisis in Myanmar and what can be done about it. The first, Courage Amid Crisis: Gendered Impacts of the Coup and the Pursuit of Gender Equality in Myanmar. And the second, Banking on the Death Trade: How Banks and Governments Enable the Military Junta of Myanmar. Madam Vice President, day by day, the military junta and its forces are losing ground both literally and figuratively. Military bases continue to fall to resistance forces. Tens of thousands of troops have been lost to casualties, surrender, or defections. The junta's access to cash is being squeezed. In response, the junta is doubling down on its brutal attacks on civilian populations while attempting to foment hatred and violence between ethnic groups. In other words, junta leaders appear committed to destroying the country that they cannot control. When I spoke to you in March, I reported that there had been a 5-fold increase in airstrikes against civilian targets. I'm sorry to report that these attacks have continued unabated, leveling villages, monasteries, hospitals, and schools. In the past few months, there have been many disturbing reports of massacres by junta foot soldiers. Many victims have been shot point blank after being interrogated. Women, children, and elders have been among those killed. As my conference room paper, Courage Amid Crisis, documents, the threat of sexual and gender-based violence is a dark shadow that follows women, girls, and LGBT people in Myanmar. Junta forces are responsible for widespread rape and other sexual crimes. The junta has launched a systematic campaign to attack women human rights defenders and to dismantle the organizations and networks that support women, girls, and LGBT people. But women's rights advocates have also told me about gender-based violence by resistance groups and increasing incidences of this violence within homes and communities. Despite its dire findings, however, my report also highlights developments that should give us all hope for Myanmar's future. Women and LGBT leaders are advancing a revolution within a revolution, working with emerging governance structures to upend patriarchal hierarchies, demand accountability, and guarantee equality and justice for future generations. Distinguished delegates, the situation in Rakhine State, where the junta is rapidly losing territory to the Arakan army, is terrifying and should concern us all. For Rohingya people, oppressed, scapegoated, exploited, and stuck between warring parties, the situation carries echoes of the lead-up to the genocidal violence of 2016 and 17. Junta airstrikes, shelling, and arson attacks have targeted both Rakhine and Rohingya villages. But the junta has gone further, deliberately stoking hatred and tensions between the Rakhine and Rohingya communities. The military has conscripted thousands of Rohingya youth, mobilizing them against the Arakan army. Even though many Rohingya young men have been taken to the front lines of the conflict against their will, they have the potential of retaliation by the Arakan community, and a downward spiral of violence is distinctly possible. Imagine young Rohingya men being forced to fight in the front lines of the very military that was responsible for genocidal attacks against their own families and communities. There are reports that link Arakan Army soldiers to human rights violations against Rohingya civilians. And the humanitarian situation for both Rakhine and Rohingya people is extremely dire. While accessing information about unfolding developments is extremely difficult, what is clear is that many thousands have been displaced and continue to be displaced in Rakhine State. Getting humanitarian aid into these conflict areas is literally a matter of life and death. But conflict and the junta's humanitarian restrictions have left thousands without any support. Starvation is a distinct possibility. I appeal to the Arakan Army to help facilitate the transfer of humanitarian aid and for the international community to provide robust support, seizing every opportunity to get this aid where it is desperately needed. Time is running out. I am concerned for those who cannot access aid and have no option but to flee for their lives and the lives of their families. I urge Bangladesh to open its border to these desperate people. But I also call on the international community to meet its responsibility to support this action by doing what it has up to now been unwilling to do: step up with the aid necessary to provide support for those in dire need with nowhere else to go. I am deeply concerned about credible reports that I have received that Bangladesh border guards have pushed Myanmar civilians back into Myanmar. I am also concerned with reports of the deportation of Myanmar refugees who had sought shelter in India, and of the imminent deportation of even more. The world must do better in addressing the root causes of the horrible developments in Myanmar that are forcing desperate people to take desperate measures. But in the meantime, we cannot turn our back on these victims, nor on our moral responsibility to protect and support them. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, in the 2 years ending March of this year, the Myanmar military purchased $630 million worth of weapons, dual-use technologies, manufacturing equipment, and raw materials through the international financial system. These transactions, in addition to shipments of aviation fuel, are helping sustain the military junta's brutal campaign of violence against civilians in Myanmar. They must be stopped. My report, Banking on the Death Trade, identified 16 foreign banks that facilitated transactions related to military procurement by the junta. To be clear, the junta and its cronies have worked to obscure the specific nature of these transactions, including setting up military front companies. Banks have described to me the difficulty of conducting due diligence under these conditions. But while the end users of these transactions have been obscured in many cases, the fact remains that banking transactions were processed that enabled attacks on civilians. That is why, in light of the inadequacy of even enhanced due diligence, I am urging financial institutions to stop facilitating transactions with banks that are controlled by the military junta, Myanmar state-owned banks, and why I am urging governments to sanction these junta-controlled banks. The conference room paper that I released last year, The Billion-Dollar Death Trade, identified Singapore as the junta's third largest source of weapons and related materials. To its credit, the government took immediate action and launched an investigation of my findings, and I am very pleased to report that the junta's purchase of military supplies from Singapore-registered companies through the international banking system dropped by nearly 90% since the publication of that report. Unfortunately, military procurement through Thailand has moved in the opposite direction. In the fiscal year ending March 2024, the junta imported nearly $130 million in weapons and weapons supplies from Thailand-registered suppliers, more than double the amount the previous year. It is important to note that as was the case with Singapore, I found no evidence that the government of Thailand was involved or even aware of these transactions. I have urged the government of Thailand to respond as Singapore did 1 year ago. And I was very pleased to learn that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs says that it will take up and look into the conference room paper's findings. I am hopeful and look forward to reporting to you that Thailand-based entities, including its banks, will no longer be facilitating the transfer of weapons and weapons materials to the military junta. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, the people of Myanmar need and deserve the support of this Council. We now have clear evidence that actions taken by the international community to isolate the junta and degrade their capacity to attack civilians are working. Military procurement through the international banking system has dropped by 1/3, but more must be done, and more must be done now to seize this momentum. Strategic coordination is required in terms of stopping these weapons, but also in terms of facilitating and directing humanitarian aid where it desperately needs to go. And finally, in light of the current trajectory in Myanmar, it is imperative that the international community support those laying the foundation of a new Myanmar, a democratic, rights-respecting Myanmar, and this includes support for organizations of courageous women and LGBT people who are advancing human rights while holding all accountable, including the resistance movement. Madam Vice President, distinguished members of this Human Rights Council, the invisible crisis in Myanmar has worsened for millions of innocent people who are under relentless attack by junta forces. But the tide is turning in Myanmar. The junta is on its heels, and the opportunity to take decisive action is now. It is imperative that this opportunity be seized. Thank you.